Yeah, I think this is really interesting because you were talking a minute ago about the fact that with Manchester, objects came into the museum slightly differently than they did in places like Liverpool, and it seems to me that quite a lot of objects were donated to the museum some time after they were originally collected. And this is a really good example because when I saw this in the museum and I picked it up, it was given by a Mrs. Bellhouse, and it's got that it was a figure of a man on a horse. And I thought it was quite a kind of a quirky, interesting looking object. And as I was looking through the other objects, quite a few were given by the same lady, donated by the same lady, and doing some sort of investigations into the documentation that the museum has, I found a whole series of correspondence that was between the museum and Mrs. Bellhouse. And what's really interesting is that these objects were collected by her uncle, who was the Belgian consul at the capital of Guinea around the turn of the 20th century. And I think going back a bit earlier as well. And Mrs. Bellhouse, her name was Marjorie, she somehow came into possession of this series of objects, and we know that she actually lived with them, in her house for some time. And she gave this object, she gave him a name, and she called him Alfred. And in her letters, one of her letters, where she donated a whole series of objects in the 1970s, she says, that she really wants to give these objects to the museum because she's really afraid there's been a spate of burglaries in her area, and she wants these objects to be looked after, and she doesn't want them to be stolen.
Yeah.
So the fact that she kind of named this guy and she kind of talks about him in the letters as if he's actually a person, just goes to show the sort of memory and the connection, the layers of connections, but in terms of her memories of her uncle maybe, but then also I guess it becomes part of her biography, having lived with these objects and the connotations of her uncle and his time in Africa and things. And so she gave a series of objects in the 70s, and then later there's even more correspondence that goes right up to the 90s. So she also when she dies in the 1990s, she actually bequeaths the rest of the objects her uncle gave her. So it's this extending through time really, so that the family connections and go right back to her uncle, and then the fact that she was so keen for these objects to be preserved and looked after by the museum.
Yeah. And it's interesting, it's like I think I've read or seen the idea of the multiple lives of objects, and how it existed from then till now, and then for her to name it, that's really sweet. It's really interesting too, how you could bond with something like that and how it represents so much more than just a man on a horse. It's her uncle and all her memories.
Exactly. And I guess she would have seen it every day, and she would have passed by it. It would have been part of her display on her sideboard, or maybe who knows where she had it, but it became part of her personal biography, as you say. So yeah.